Everyone overlooked it. A footnote, one line. But when the judge read it aloud, the room shifted. Because sometimes the smallest details carry the heaviest consequences. My name is Alara Vance, and for 3 agonizing years, I built a life with a ghost. A man whose promises were written in vanishing ink. I stood by him through the bankruptcy he swore was bad luck, through the mysterious business trips that left me alone in a house that felt more like a museum of broken dreams. I signed what he asked me to sign, trusting the man I loved. But the man I loved was a meticulously crafted illusion. Now I stand in a cold, echoing courtroom facing him. My husband, Julian, and his pack of sleek, expensive lawyers. They've painted me as greedy, unstable, a burden he nobly carried. My own lawyer looks weary, outmatched. Julian's lead attorney has just finished his closing argument, a masterpiece of character assassination. The air is thick with their victory. The judge's face is unreadable. I feel the eyes of the courtroom, pitying, dismissive, and the last of my hope begins to crumble. I look utterly defeated, but I hold on to one desperate thread. A footnote. Footnote 7. In a mountain of financial disclosures, one line I insisted on adding. They all dismissed it as the frantic scribbling of a desperate woman. Even my attorney sighed when I demanded it stay. But I knew the devil wasn't just in the details, he was in the footnote. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. The scent of expensive espresso and lemon-scented polish couldn't mask the sterile dread of the courtroom. Alara Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, her spine a rigid line against the tsunami of humiliation rolling from the defense. Across the polished expanse, her husband, Julian, was a study in tailored sorrow. His charcoal suit was a masterpiece of understated wealth, his expression one of pained endurance, as if he were the one being publicly flayed. He caught her eye for a fleeting second, and the ghost of a smile, not of warmth, but of profound, chilling pity, touched his lips before he turned back to his lead attorney, the formidable Robert Calthrop, who was currently eviscerating her character with the precision of a cardiac surgeon. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, Calthrop's voice was a smooth, expensive baritone meant for boardrooms and golf clubs. What we have here is not a story of a failed marriage, but a story of a failed investment. My client, Julian Vance, invested everything, his passion, his brilliance, his capital into building a life. His wife, Alara, invested in handbags, luxury spas, and a social media facade. He gestured dismissively toward her, and Alara felt the hot, judgmental gaze of the handful of observers in the gallery. She could see the narrative crystallizing in the mind of the judge, the Honorable Miriam Wright, the long-suffering financier and his frivolous, gold-digging wife. It was a story Julian had been workshopping for years, she realized with a sickening jolt. Long before the divorce, he'd been laying the groundwork, painting her as the decorative, spendthrift burden he nobly carried. Her own attorney, Mark, shifted uncomfortably beside her. He was competent, diligent, but he was a family law practitioner in a boutique firm, a sturdy rowboat facing Calthrop's armored battleship. He'd warned her. Their documentation is flawless, Alara. It's a fortress. The $3 million transfer is logged as a business loss, corroborated by the lawsuit from his partner. We can argue intent, but paper usually wins. The paper, mountains of it. Julian's world was built on it, a labyrinth of legalese and ledger entries designed to confound and conceal. Alara's mind drifted back, not to the beginning of their love, that memory was too tarnished now, but to the moment the first crack became a chasm. It was a Thursday. Julian was on another stress relief golf trip. She'd been searching for a receipt for their accountant, rummaging through the locked drawer of his home office desk, a drawer whose key she'd found taped beneath the bottom of his antique humidor. She hadn't been looking for betrayal. She'd been looking for a scrap of paper from a restaurant. Instead, she found the sleek secondary phone. It wasn't filled with salacious texts or illicit photos. It was worse. It was a blueprint. Threads with someone named K. Forsyth discussed finalizing the Midas migraine, triggering the liquidity event, and the Q4 dump. One phrase sent from Julian chilled her blood. Once the asset migration is complete and the liability firewall is active via the partner suit, the primary vessel will be scuttled. Clean break. E gets the debt, we get the ocean. She was E, a liability to be firewalled, a vessel to be scuttled. When she confronted him, trembling with the phone in her hand, he hadn't denied it. He'd taken the phone, placed it gently on the counter, and sighed as if she were a child struggling with advanced calculus. Alara, he'd said, pouring her a glass of wine she didn't want. This is why I handle these things. Midas Holdings is a strategic vehicle. The migraine is a complex tax strategy. The lawsuit from Carl is a pre-negotiated, strategic dissolution of a partnership that's run its course. It's how you protect assets in a litigious world. He'd cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You think I'm leaving you with nothing? My God, darling, this is me securing everything for us. Once this tempest in a teapot blows over, the funds are repatriated better than ever. It's a shell game, yes, but a legal one for our future. He then presented her with a fresh, bound document, the Asset Reallocation and Strategic Shielding Agreement. I need you to sign this. It's a formality. It shows unity. It protects us both. She'd balked. She cried. She screamed. He'd remained calm, a rock in the face of her hysterics, which only made her feel more unstable, more like the fragile burden he claimed she was. Just trust me, he'd said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Haven't I always taken care of you? Haven't I built this world for you? The vows they'd taken for richer, for poorer, echoed perversely in her head. He was engineering the poorer to cheat her out of the richer. Exhausted, emotionally hollowed out, and trapped in his flawless logic, she had signed. Her pen had scratched against the paper, a sound like a ratchet tightening a shackle. That signature was the weapon Calthrop was now using to bludgeon her. He held up a copy of that very agreement. And here, Your Honor, on page 17, is Mrs. Vance's explicit acknowledgement and consent to the strategic reallocation of the disputed assets. She was not kept in the dark. She was a willing participant in a strategy she now, conveniently, claims to not understand. Mark had risen, objecting, but the damage was done. The narrative was set. She was complicit, and her divorce filing was merely seller's remorse, as Julian had coolly stated in his deposition. Alara had watched that deposition video, nauseated. He'd been under oath, his face a mask of earnest regret. Alara was always anxious about money, he'd said, a gentle sorrow in his eyes. She loved the results of my work but hated the complexity. When I explained this consolidation was to protect us, she agreed. She signed. Now, seeing the temporary downturn on paper, she's panicked. I understand. I just wish, he'd trailed off, the picture of a wounded, misunderstood provider. Sitting in the courtroom, that memory was a fresh wound. Her gaze dropped to the single sheet of paper before her, the exhibit list. Her eyes found item 47, Asset Reallocation Agreement, Vance v. Vance. A memory, sharp and clear, cut through the fog of her despair. The night after she'd signed that dreadful document, a spark of her old self, the meticulous, observant graphic designer who could spot a pixel out of place, had flared. She returned to the document, reading every line with a new, chilling clarity. On page 23, listed among a dozen other assets, was the line, Liquid Capital Reserve, $3 million, for transfer to Midas Holdings LLC for portfolio diversification. Beneath that line, in her own neat, precise handwriting, she had added a tiny asterisk note. She had written, transfer value subject to independent verification of Midas Holdings LLC's solvency as of Q4 2023. At the time, it had felt like a pathetic act of defiance, a tiny claw mark on the prison wall. When she'd insisted it be included in the evidence bundle for the trial, Mark had rubbed his temples. Alara, it's a footnote. They'll argue it's an unsigned marginal note with no contractual weight. It makes us look nitpicky, desperate. Julian's legal team, upon disclosure, had formally dismissed it as a de minimis post-signature scribble with no bearing on the executed agreement. They had, as predicted, overlooked it. Now, as Calthrop moved to sit down, the satisfied silence in the courtroom was absolute. Julian adjusted his cufflinks. Judge Wright's pen hovered over her notes. Alara looked defeated because, in that moment, she was. Every piece of evidence, every sworn testimony, every slick argument was a brick in the wall Julian had built around the truth. Her shoulders slumped. She had pinned a ludicrous hope on a single line of text, a footnote nobody but her had ever given a second thought. The gavel was poised to fall, and with it, the final official endorsement of Julian's lie. She closed her eyes, waiting for the sound of her own legal annihilation. The silence after Calthrop's final, dismissive gesture was a physical weight on Alara's chest. She could feel the conclusion of the room settling like dust. Judge Wright's face was an impassive mask, but her eyes, sharp and flinty behind her glasses, were scanning the final summary document before her. Mark leaned over, his whisper barely audible. "I'll do my best in the rebuttal, but we need a miracle. The paper trail..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The paper trail was a masterpiece of fraudulent construction, and they were buried beneath it. Mark stood, clearing his throat. He began his closing argument, a recitation of good faith, of hidden intent, of the fundamental unfairness of Julian's scheme. His words were earnest, logical, and they sounded hopelessly weak against the sleek, evidence-backed narrative Calthrop had woven. Alara watched Judge Wright's expression. A slight tightening of the lips, a glance at the clock on the wall. She was losing her. They were losing everything. Just as Mark was reaching his peroration, gesturing toward Alara to illustrate her victimhood, Judge Wright held up a hand. "Counsel, a moment." Her voice was dry, precise. She wasn't looking at Mark. She was tapping a single finger on the open binder before her, the master exhibit bundle. Her gaze lifted and landed not on Julian or his lawyers, but on the document itself. "Mr. Calthrop," she said, and the room stilled further. "This document, Exhibit 47, the Asset Reallocation Agreement, page 23. Calthrop rose smoothly, a hint of polite curiosity on his face. "Yes, Your Honor." "There is a footnote here, footnote 7. Judge Wright adjusted her glasses, leaning forward slightly. "It pertains to the listed $3 million transfer. It states, and I quote, 'Transfer value subject to independent verification of Midas Holdings LLC's solvency as of Q4 2023. She looked up, her eyes now like laser points. Was this independent verification ever obtained and provided to Mrs. Vance? A beat of perfect, hollow silence. Alara's heart gave a single, massive thud against her ribs. She stopped breathing. Calthrop's polished facade didn't crack, but it did hesitate. He offered a small, conciliatory smile. Your Honor, with respect, that marginal note was added by Mrs. Vance after the fact. It's not an integrated term of the contract. It was a personal note, a matter of her own anxieties. The solvency of Midas was, of course, inherent to the transaction. It was a functional entity. Inherent, Judge Wright's eyebrow arched, a silent, dangerous signal. Counselor, the footnote does not say hoped for or assumed. It says subject to. That is a condition precedent, a contractual trigger. Your client signed the document directly below this list. His signature acknowledges the entire content of the page, including its annotations, unless specifically stricken. Her tone was leaving the realm of inquiry and entering the territory of declaration. So I ask again for the record, was the condition, the independent verification of solvency, fulfilled? Mark was on his feet now, electrified. No, Your Honor, it was not. We have subsequently obtained records from the Secretary of State showing that Midas Holdings LLC had its charter dissolved for noncompliance 18 months prior to the date of this agreement. It was not merely insolvent, it was a non-existent shell. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and profound. It was as if a window had been blown open, letting in a rush of cold, clarifying air. The vague, complex cloud of financial manipulation suddenly had a hard, sharp edge, a broken contract term, in writing, signed by Julian himself. Calthrop began to speak, his tone shifting to one of dismissive damage control. Your Honor, this is a technicality being blown out of proportion. The intent of the agreement was clear. The transfer was made to the controlling partner's account for the purposes of... The intent, Judge Wright interrupted, her voice cutting like a whip, appears to have been to transfer $3 million of marital assets to a defunct corporate entity, in direct violation of a condition your client agreed to on paper. This moves the discussion from intent and strategy into the realm of possible fraudulent inducement and deliberate concealment. The word fraudulent hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Julian, for the first time, moved. He shifted in his chair, the leather letting out a small, protesting sigh. His eyes darted to Calthrop, a flash of pure, unvarnished panic there and gone. Your Honor, Calthrop tried again, but Judge Wright was already turning to Mark. Counsel, You have argued bad faith and dissipation. Does this footnote, in your view, provide a foundation for that argument?" Mark, sensing the tectonic shift, didn't just step into the opening, he charged through it. "It is the foundation, Your Honor. This isn't a minor detail. This footnote was Mrs. Vance's sole attempt to insert a checkpoint, a moment of transparency, into a process her husband was rushing her through. By ignoring this condition, by transferring funds to a phantom company, Mr. Vance didn't just violate the spirit of the agreement, he violated its one concrete, written term. This proves the entire reallocation was a sham. The strategic shielding was, in fact, theft. The footnote doesn't just suggest bad faith, it documents it." Judge Wright nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. She turned her gaze back to Julian. "Mr. Vance, I am considering, based on this new clarity, recalling you to the stand. Under oath, I would like you to explain to the court why you directed a $3 million marital asset to be sent to a company that legally did not exist, in direct contradiction to a condition in the document you signed." Julian's face lost its carefully cultivated color. He looked at Calthrop, who gave a minute, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Being recalled now, under the judge's palpable suspicion, would be a slaughter. "Your Honor," Calthrop said, his voice finally stripped of its condescending smoothness, revealing the strained steel beneath. "We would request a brief recess to consult with our client on this unexpected line of questioning." "Denied," Judge Wright said flatly. "Sit down, Mr. Calthrop." She steepled her fingers, her eyes never leaving Julian. "The court is not interested in coached testimony. The document speaks for itself. The factual record is clear. The condition was not met. Therefore, the transfer was not authorized under the terms of the very agreement Mr. Vance relies upon to justify it." She paused, letting the finality of that statement crush the last of the defense's momentum. This footnote transforms the case. What was presented as a complex financial maneuver now appears, prima facie, as a simple, documentable breach of a written marital agreement. A breach that suggests a pattern of deceit aimed at unlawfully depriving Mrs. Vance of a marital asset. She turned her head toward Alara. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Alara saw something in the judge's eyes other than impatience or neutrality. It was a flicker of recognition, of understanding. It was the look one professional gives another when they see through a clever forgery to the truth beneath. "Mr. Calthrop," Judge Wright continued, her voice lower now, but somehow carrying even more power. "Your entire argument rests on the validity and good faith execution of Exhibit 47. That foundation now appears to be rotten. You may proceed with your final summation if you wish, but you will do so with the understanding that the court gives significant, and likely determinative, weight to this failure of a specifically contracted condition." Calthrop stood frozen for a second, then slowly sank into his chair. He didn't look at Julian. He stared at the table in front of him, his mind visibly racing, scrambling for a playbook that had just been incinerated. The omnipotent fortress of paper had a crack, and through it, a single, relentless beam of light was now pouring in, illuminating the hollow interior. The room no longer felt like a theater of Julian's victory. It felt like a courtroom again. And Julian Vance was no longer the tragically misunderstood genius. He was a man who had been caught, by one line of text, in a lie so fundamental it unraveled everything. The gavel was still poised, but its trajectory had changed. It was no longer aimed at Alara. The silence after Judge Wright's pronouncement was no longer heavy with Alara's impending defeat. It was charged, electric, a collective holding of breath as the axis of the room tilted irrevocably. Julian's composure had disintegrated. He wasn't the sorrowful magnate anymore. He was a cornered animal, his eyes darting between his stricken lawyers and the judge's implacable face. Calthrop's request for a recess had been a Hail Mary, and it had been swatted down. There was no more maneuvering room. The footnote was not a technicality. It was a tripwire, and Julian had stumbled over it in plain view of the court. Judge Wright did not recall him to the stand. She didn't need to. The evidentiary record, now reframed by her sharp questioning, was sufficient. She moved directly to her ruling, her voice devoid of theatrics, each word a cold, clean chisel striking stone. "The court finds," she began, and the finality in her tone made even the gallery spectators straighten. that the transfer of $3 million in marital assets was conducted in violation of a specific written condition of the Asset Reallocation Agreement, a document signed by both parties. The condition of independent solvency verification was material, and its breach is fundamental. Accordingly, the court finds that the transfer constituted a fraudulent dissipation of marital assets. Alara felt the words like a physical unclenching in her chest. Fraudulent dissipation. It was the legal term they had chased for a year. Mark had said it was nearly impossible to prove without a smoking gun. Footnote 7 had been that gun, a tiny, Derringer-sized one, but it had fired with devastating accuracy. Judge Wright was not finished. The defendant's reliance on this flawed agreement to justify the removal of assets from the marital estate demonstrates a pattern of deceit and bad faith that this court will not countenance. She listed her orders, methodically dismantling Julian's world. The $3 million was to be immediately repatriated and considered part of the marital estate for equitable distribution. Furthermore, as a penalty for his conduct, Julian was to forfeit his entire equity stake in the primary marital residence to Alara, free and clear. He was also ordered to pay 60% of his remaining, legitimate investment portfolio to her, an amount that dwarfed the original sum in dispute. Finally, he was to be solely responsible for all of Alara's legal fees and court costs. Sanctions against the defendant and his counsel for pursuing a claim built on a fraudulent premise will be considered in a separate hearing, she added, and Calthrop actually flinched. The gavel fell. The sound was not loud, but it echoed in the new silence. It was over. In the shocked aftermath, Julian turned to her. His mask was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered fury that was somehow more pathetic than menacing. He leaned across the barrier between the tables, his voice a low, strained hiss meant only for her. "A footnote, Alara. You destroyed everything over a footnote." There was no apology, no remorse, only a staggering inability to comprehend how his meticulously architected scheme had been felled by something he deemed so insignificant. Alara looked at him, really looked at him. The elegant suit now seemed like a costume on a shrunken man. The fury in his eyes was the outrage of a chess master who lost to a pawn moving in a way he'd never considered. She felt no triumph, only a profound, weary clarity. She did not answer him. She simply gathered her purse and the single, now historic exhibit sheet with its tiny, typed asterisk and her handwritten sentence. She turned and walked away, Mark stunned, jubilant whisper at her shoulder feeling very far away. 1 year later, the light in Alara's downtown studio apartment was the pure, golden light of late afternoon, not the cold, recessed glare of Julian's mausoleum of a house. Canvases leaned against white walls, and a large digital tablet glowed on her desk, displaying a vibrant logo design for a new client, a women's cooperative startup. Her business, Precise Vision Design, was thriving. The financial security from the settlement wasn't just money. It was oxygen, space, the freedom to choose clients who valued her mind, not just her former association with Julian Vance. A piece of certified mail lay on her reclaimed wood dining table. She opened it earlier. It was the final, closed notice from the federal district court. The information Judge Wright had uncovered and referenced in her final judgment, the defunct Midas Holdings, the sham lawsuit with his partner Carl Forsyth, had triggered an SEC and FBI investigation. The notice was dry legalese, but the outcome was clear. Julian and Forsyth were facing charges of wire fraud and securities fraud. His professional reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was obliterated. The empire of paper had been inspected and found to be counterfeit. Alara filed the letter away in a small fireproof box with the other legal documents. It was not a trophy. It was an artifact, a fossil from a life she had survived. She looked out the window at the bustling city below, a city that no longer felt like his territory. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been her soundtrack for years was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady resonance of her own making. She met her friend Chloe for coffee at a bustling independent shop downstairs. As she laughed at a story, the sound felt unfamiliar and wonderful in her own ears, unforced, unrehearsed. Chloe touched her hand. "You look like you again," she said. Alara simply smiled. She was more than again. She was new. Later, back in her quiet studio, As she prepared to record a voiceover for her design portfolio site, she thought not of the courtroom or the footnote or Julian's crumbling face. She thought of the silence after the gavel, the pure, empty space that had followed the end of his noise. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice calm and clear. "They tell you not to sweat the small stuff," she said, the words forming not just for the recording but for the ghost of her former self. To focus on the big picture. But sometimes the most powerful truth isn't in the broad stroke. It's in the detail everyone else glosses over. It's in the period, the clause, the single line there sure doesn't matter. She paused, the memory of the judge's finger tapping that page vivid behind her eyes. Because sometimes, all it takes to change everything is the courage to write your own footnote. She stopped the recording. The silence that followed was peaceful. It was hers.